Okay, we got somebody. All right, give it up, guys.
Yeah.
Okay.
Let's go.
All right. Okay.
No pressure.
We'll see. It's good.
Yeah.
This is a work in progress. So,
Come on, speak, Daddy. Huh? Fun time. Let's call it fun time. Come on, Daddy, fun time, fun time.
Hello there, and welcome to Weird Music on the Glumberger channel. The show where we look at all sorts of different albums, releases available to us, albums that are out there. We have a discussion about what they are, and hopefully, if it all goes correctly, we introduce you, the viewer, to something that you may not have heard about potentially. So, today we're returning to the UK tape label Steep Gloss. For another descent into pure madness, basically. To be perfectly honest, though, I think I'm definitely asking for trouble whenever I get Steep Gloss involved at this rate. As I mentioned in the video for Giblet Gusset and Brian Rook, there's tons of albums on this label that I really want to talk about, as it's without a doubt one of the most weirdest, unusual record labels I've ever come across, in my many years of reviewing music. To be honest as well, though, weird does an injustice. It's truly unclassifiable for the most part, and for half the time purely unlistenable, but at the same time fascinating. It's weirdness draws you in just to discover more and more, basically. So today we have another unclassifiable album from the record label, one that is without a doubt one of the most peculiar albums that I've listened to from start to finish multiple times. Today I present Papal Bull's Let's Call It Fun Time.
An old man, a wise man, must squinch up his eyes, raise a sheltering palm to his brow, and actually will himself into the distance. Did you know that? But of course not, as a young man.
Oh god, where to begin with this one? I don't even know. Of course we'll ask ourselves the question, who are Papal Bull? Well, Papal Bull, it's an experimental abstract project comprised of members John Marshall and Joe Murray. And together, this project sees them delving into the most absurd of experimentalism, creating some truly esoteric records that are really difficult to wrap your head around. And the project, they've got a handful of releases on various record labels and on various Bandcamp pages, and they all offer very unusual and different listening experiences, For example, their release for the record label Chocolate Monk, a record titled in Ceres, a pig with human hands and feet was born. It is a truly strange record that I have not even been able to finish yet because it's such a bombardment of just caustic noise, I feel like. Oh, it's so unusual. But yeah, like, defining the project genre, I think it's an impossible task. Like, you can call it experimental, but like, it's beyond that. It's just an expression of weird stuff, basically. And every record as well that I've come across, and they're all very different, and it results in this very varied and unusual discography. And so the album we're talking about today, let's call it Fun Time. Truly a strange record to listen to. Released on cassette, of course, by Steep Gloss, the album offers us two compositions. The A-side featuring 8 Humans on Disorder, etc., and the B-side featuring Sword, Pestilent, Wild Beasts, etc. The album itself is accompanied with a small piece of written text both on the Bandcamp page and within the liner notes on the cassette release, going as follows. See Teddy drawing a giant boat. Taste carrots. Hear Teddy screaming. Touch bench. Smell rubbish. And so generally speaking, this doesn't really do much for us in providing us with a direct context for what the hell it is we're actually listening to and what's contained on this recording. But I do really enjoy esoteric texts. And much like these strange cassette releases that we seem to have been exploring in a lot of the last few episodes, all we can go by is the information being provided to us. The images, the text, the music, etc., etc. What I find interesting though is within this text itself, however strange it is an expression of the 5 senses, of course. Sight, taste, hearing, touch, and smell. And to be perfectly honest then, I'm at a huge disadvantage here because I can only see and hear this recording. I can't touch it as the cassette is now sold out and I can't acquire a copy without paying extortionate postage fees. I can't smell it because I don't have a physical copy in my presence again. And of course, I can't taste it because I don't have the physical cassette. But also, that would be really weird putting a plastic cassette in my mouth. But that's what came to mind when starting to write about this album. I feel like they've mentioned the 5 senses because maybe that's a point they're trying to express with this very strange work, but beyond that I just don't know. I just have no idea. This is a very weird tangent, but this is a very weird album, to be fair, so anything goes. Well, let's talk about the music. Let's talk about what we can hear. The album, these compositions, they're really hard to dissect, and trying to get into the meat of them is really difficult because they are just baffling overloads of audio stimulus coming at you through your headphones, And with so much happening, I mean, arguably not a great amount happening, but it feels like there's a lot happening here. I say your brain, but actually it might just be my brain. There's no real way for me to tangibly attach to any single thing that I'm hearing, and everything just occurs all at once, proceeding at its pace regardless of whether or not you, the listener, or in this case me, are keeping up. And so to get into a bit of it though, or try my best to anyway, 8 Humans on Disorder, etc., the first track, opens up with sort of a, I call it medieval Baroque sounding instrumental thing. It's very sort of boop, 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 boop kind of thing. It's very weird. It's offset by these spoken word passages though, and at first you get a single voice though telling the story. It starts off very strangely. It's very amusing to follow along to. And then, yeah, like you're listening to it, you're listening to the spoken word, listening to the story being said, all this little music going on. That's fine, right? That's fine. However, about halfway through, I think it is, one of the most confusing things starts to happen. And that is when the spoken word passages begin again, only this time it's a multitude of voices, all speaking the same script, all out of tandem with each other. It is a truly baffling experience, and I cannot properly listen to this. Like, I have heard this album so many times now, but I cannot fathom a single thing going on in this section this section of the first track, because I just get completely overloaded by hearing all of these voices speaking at once. It's like my brain doesn't know what specifically to listen to, and instead it just gives up. And then the music just continues to play, and so you're just sort of, almost like in your peripherals, but in your hearing, if that makes sense, just listening to all these voices going off, and nothing sounds like actual humans, like an actual story, because it's just such an overload and bombardment of sounds. It's so weird and confusing and baffling, but I think there's something truly fascinating about that, though. And you should know me by now. I really appreciate music, recordings, art, whatever you would call it, that, puts me into this kind of unique headspace. And this one truly does, though. Like, the overloading sensation of it is so weirdly interesting because it's so different, if that makes sense. And I don't know if I could properly express it all in words, though. It's interesting. There's a story that they're talking about, I'm sure, or maybe it's poetry. I can't tell you, exactly for sure. But it's like my brain just cannot follow it, no matter how hard I want it to. Though it's just all of these, it's like my brain just refuses to cooperate when these 8 or so voices are all speaking at the same time. It's like if you're in a group and then everyone's talking at the same time. It's like who do you listen to? And it's like my brain can't keep up, and I just find that very interesting. But let's move on though. There is a second track on this album, Sword, Pestilence, Wild Beasts, etc. And so in some ways, this track explores similar concepts and similar experimental approaches established on the first half, of the cassette. And in other ways it doesn't. And this one is, once again, a really baffling, bonkers experience. It comes across to me as this smorgasbord of children's voices all speaking over each other again in this frenetic and frenzied fashion almost. But whereas in the first track you can sort of clearly hear that there's, multiple voices all speaking at once, I think maybe overlaid over each other or purposely doing so. This one, it's the children's voices aren't purposely speaking over each other. They're just simply playing made-up games with each other, and thus it's almost kind of directionless because the children just imagine their own scenarios and just make things up on the spot, And it creates, they'll speak over each other, but not in that same way because, the children are just doing what children do, basically. And it's kind of fascinating again. And to be fair, I think there's something kind of delightful about it, actually. There's something very twisted about the way it's being presented on this track, though. Once again, it's kind of an overload of different sound sources colliding with each other. But there's of course musical elements here and there, of course, that helps to move it all along whilst giving us this very surreal presence to it all. But yeah, it just becomes so strange when you try to listen to exactly what is being said. And because it's children playing up made-up games, it's simply nonsense, right? But I have to admit, it's kind of funny though, because every now and then you clearly hear what one of the children is saying, and it's just hilariously baffling, And it's lovely to hear them just using their imaginations to come up with such wonderful games and scenarios, It's kind of a lovely contrast, actually, to the very first track. That one seemed to combine the same written word, same spoken word, from a number of different voices. Whilst this track presents, technically you could call it improvisational dialogue from these children. And, both tracks, though, they're presented with these unusual backing instrumentals that kind of feel Baroque and medieval for some reason. I don't know why I describe it as that, but it's the only thing that comes to mind for some reason. But it gives it this really weird presence, though, that is really not of this place and time for some reason. It's really weird, but kind of oddly delightful for some reason in parts. And no, and going back to the second track though, I love the imagination of these children as they just talk about dragons and cakes and slugs and snails and things. It sounds like a really fun game they're playing, whatever it is, you know, the kind where they're just making up the rules as you go along. But yeah, it's so weird though, like at times though, like it goes into to really unsettling experimental sound art stuff where it just sounds like, it doesn't sound like human speech, but it's definitely been sourced from it. But it's so difficult to follow along to for some reason. But yeah, before we finish off though talking about these tracks, it's perhaps worth mentioning though that you know, especially in the liner notes, it's credited to you know, various family members and friends and stuff. And I assume that, you know, both these children and the voices in the first track as well are the contributing family members that Paperboy mentioned in these liner notes. And it's interesting that, you know, they've they've gotten their family involved in what is now an incredibly strange and unusual record, right? And I certainly wonder what their opinions of this are, if they actually are even able to listen to it, because surely, like, it's just baffling as well, right? Especially if you were on this. But yeah, there is a lot of experimental elements being explored on both these tracks, and you know, perhaps the etc. portions of the track names, you know, as they, you know, it's kind of an expression of the delving into the weird sound art experiments that just play entirely by their own rules. And it's especially in that last track, actually. Towards the end of it, you get this deluge of sound sources colliding again in this really weird fashion, and it's so strange and unusual, but there's something really interesting about it. And to be fair, though, I think by this point, as listeners, we're already so confused, right, by the whole experience, that the surreal nature of exactly what it is we're hearing on the recording just kind of washes over you for some reason. And I find records like that truly fascinating, though. They're such a peculiar expression of experimental notions that don't really consider how comfortable the listener's going to be when they listen to the entire thing. And as recordings, as art projects, they just exist as they are. And our reactions to it, regardless of what they specifically are, they're almost secondary to the content itself, I feel. I find that weirdly fascinating for some reason. I don't know why. But yeah, I think we might as well just come to the end of our episode of Weird Music there, to be perfectly honest. It's another really confusing and unusual album experience that's really difficult to comprehend at times, but in terms of experimental music, just fascinating to me for some reason. Like, the more I dive into this record label, the more I find really weird stuff that I really want to, like, share with you, the audience. And as well, though, like, the title, let's call it Fun Time. Why is it called that? Like, is it a trick on us as listeners, you know, of the media? Because, yeah, some of it's fun, especially in the second track, I feel, but other parts are scary and unsettling and baffling. So is that fun time? I have no idea. But this is the fascination of experimental music, though. The way your brain tries to comprehend what it is exactly you're listening to, it becomes a very interesting process as the album progresses. And of course, with there being such a wide spectrum of different brains that interpret information in a whole bunch of different ways, it kind of suggests that there's a number of different ways this album is going to be experienced, if that makes sense, you know? Especially when listening to media like this, I mean. Of course, though, I'm just waffling on and on about confusing concepts, but this whole album was so confusing. I feel like all this confusion and mentioning stuff that is confusing is probably apt. I don't know, maybe it doesn't matter. Who knows? In any case, I would like to thank you for watching today's episode of Weird Music. I would also like to recommend that you go to Steep Gloss's Bandcamp, start checking out some of the albums, and if you have a favourite, do let me know, because I'd like to start discovering more of these, because it's one of those things where you get drawn into a specific album for whatever reason, and yeah, finding the time to listen to everything's going to be very difficult, so let me know what weird stuff you find on that label, perhaps. And with that, I wish you all the best, take care, and bye-bye for now. Bye-bye!
There was some hot, and they wrote that one called with
Yeah?
the